Welcome. Good morning, Julia. Well, we have finished our lessons about Matthew's opening, 1:1 to 4:17. We finished those up, so there aren't any more lessons in your class book that we're going to be speaking about. However, today and in the next 2 or 3 classes, I think we only have 2 left after this, what I'm going to do is focus on some lessons about the kingdom of heaven. I want to focus on this idea of Matthew, the kingdom of heaven, because it is such a major element of Matthew's message, as we'll see today. And what I want us to do in these last few classes is just kind of do a topical. I'll just kind of choose what are some things about the kingdom of heaven that Matthew is telling us, and why is that so important for us to understand and for our discipleship. So I invite you to open your Bibles to Matthew 13. We're going to go there eventually. Matthew 13. While you're doing that, let me just kind of lay some groundwork here to remind us about what we're talking about when we talk about the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is everything. The kingdom of heaven is the solution to all the problems that we mourn over. As we've discussed in this class, the kingdom of heaven is a shorthand. It's a shorthand phrase to express the hope of the Old Testament that was promised, that God would step in and exercise His reign, His kingship, to fix everything in creation. And so, just to be clear here, before I show you some Old Testament passages, when Matthew or when Jesus talk about the kingdom of heaven, the reign of heaven, it is not talking about the church. That's not what this message is about. Jesus is not going around the villages of Galilee and announcing that the church is coming, the community is coming. Now, to be clear, the reign of God, when He steps in and He brings His kingship to creation in a new way, that is going to result in the formation of a new community, the Messiah's community, which will no longer be defined by ethnicity. It will be a community of all nations who have faith in Jesus as the Messiah. So included in the idea of God's reign is the formation of a people. But that's not what John the Baptizer and Jesus are saying when they come on the scene and they say, "Repent, for the reign of heaven is at hand." They're using a shorthand phrase to express the promise of the Old Testament that Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who is already king of creation because He's the creator, He is going to step in and He's going to exercise His reign, His kingship, in a new and powerful way, and it's going to set everything right that's gone wrong in creation. And so we've looked at passages like this from Isaiah 40, verses 9 and 10. "Go on up to a high mountain, O Zion, herald of gospel, herald of good news. Lift up your voice with strength, O Jerusalem, herald of good news. Lift it up. Fear not. Say to the cities of Judah, behold your God. Behold, the Lord Yahweh comes with might, and His arm rules for Him. Behold, His reward is with Him, and His recompense before Him." The good news of Isaiah is that God will come to exercise His rulership, which will mean reward and recompense. That is, setting things right that have gotten messed up. And then again in Isaiah 52, how beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of Him who brings gospel, good news, who publishes peace, who brings good news of happiness, who publishes salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. The voice of your watchmen, they lift up their voice. Together they sing for joy, for eye to eye they see the return of Yahweh to Zion. Yahweh has bared his holy arm before the eyes of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. The good news is that Yahweh will return to Zion to reign, which means peace, happiness, salvation. And the salvation that Yahweh brings is an act of his kingship. It is an act of his rulership. So when we talk about salvation, like Rex did this morning, when we talk about God bringing salvation to the earth, what we are talking about is God exercising his kingship. It is an act of his kingship that has brought salvation to human beings and to creation. And he will accomplish this kingly act of salvation in the sight of all nations. This is what Isaiah promised. And then one more that I actually haven't brought up in this class before. In Zechariah, when Zechariah is describing that future day when Yahweh will defeat all the enemies of his people, Zechariah describes the resulting life and refreshment from that victory as living waters. And here's what Zechariah says will occur. Here's his promise. On that day, living waters shall flow out from Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea and half of them to the western sea. All the world, in other words. It shall continue in summer as in winter, a never-ending supply of life. And Yahweh will be king over all the earth. That's the day that the prophets promised. It is this idea that Yahweh will be king over all the earth, that vision that Zechariah is giving to encourage the people of God, that future day, that is what Jesus is talking about when he says in Matthew 6 to pray, your kingdom come. We are to be people who are looking for and waiting for this day when Yahweh will be king over all the earth, when his reign will be recognized and there will be no more opposition. Everything on earth will reflect his will on earth as it is in heaven. That's what Jesus is getting at in what we call the Lord's Prayer. That vision. And the good news of Matthew's gospel is that this day, this promise, when Yahweh will step in to reign, where he will be king over all the earth, what Matthew is telling us is that this has already begun. And it has begun in the form of Jesus of Nazareth. When Matthew tells us, from that time, Jesus began to preach, saying, repent, for the kingdom or reign of heaven is at hand. And he went throughout all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news, the gospel of the kingdom, the reign of heaven, and healing every disease and every affliction among the people. The gospel of Isaiah, the good news of Isaiah that he had promised, where he proclaimed that Yahweh would come to rule, to reign, that he would bring salvation. That time has arrived, according to Matthew. Jesus brings the good news of the kingdom. That is, the good news that God is doing what he promised. He is stepping in as king to fix everything that is wrong in the cosmos that he has made. And that means happiness, peace, salvation, just as Isaiah had promised. And even here in this passage, we see that it means healing and restoration to human beings. So, with all of that as kind of introduction, to remind us about what are we talking about when we talk about, or when Matthew talks about, the kingdom of heaven, the reign of heaven. He's using that shorthand phrase to talk about this idea from the Jewish scriptures. That the ultimate goal that we're waiting for is for God to step in as king and to exercise his kingship to fix everything. And Matthew is telling us God has already begun to do that in Jesus. It's been inaugurated. It hasn't been fully consummated. That won't happen until the Lord's return, till Jesus' return. But it has been inaugurated. God has stepped in as king, and He has stepped in to reign as king in the form of this man from Nazareth. And then Matthew's gospel will then teach us, what does this then mean? What is the reign of heaven like? The reign of God. What is He like as king? What does it mean to live under the reign of God or the reign of heaven? What are its values? What do we learn about God from how He reigns? These are all the questions that I want to examine with you today as well as in the next two classes. And that's why I've called this little three-part series, Lessons About the Kingdom of Heaven. And today, we're going to look at a particular passage where Jesus is going to teach us something about the reign of heaven. Now, I had asked you to turn to Matthew 13. I need to first, before we get into our text, I need to ask you this question because we need to be clear on what Matthew 13 is telling us. Let me just ask you this. What are the parables in Matthew 13 about? What are they about? If someone asked you that, what would your answer be? What are the parables in Matthew 13 about? What'd you say, Rob? The kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven. Take a look at Matthew 13. We may not think of the parables this way, possibly because of things we've overlooked in our reading, or maybe because of how they've been taught to us. The parable of the sower. We probably all know that parable. That parable is about the kingdom of heaven. Look at Matthew 13 and look at verse 18. Jesus makes this very clear. Matthew 13:18. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom, this entire parable is about how do people respond to the message that Yahweh is king. This message that now comes with Jesus. The fact that God is stepping in and exercising His kingship. Why don't human beings, or in this particular case, why doesn't Israel accept that? Why isn't that a message that everybody responds to with joy and thanksgiving? The parable of the sower will explain that. Why that is. Skip a few verses down and, well, what about the parable of the weeds? Look at chapter 13, look at verse 24. He put another parable to them, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in the field. Kingdom of heaven. That's what that parable is about. The promised reign of heaven that the prophets had promised. Skip down to verse 31. He put another parable to them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like. That parable is all about the kingdom of heaven. Look at verse 33. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven. It's all about the kingdom of heaven. Look at verse 44. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. Kingdom of heaven. That's what that parable is about. Or look at verse 45. What about the parable of the pearl? Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant. It's all about the reign of heaven. And then finally in verse 47. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net. All of these parables are meant to teach us something about God's reign. His promised reign, the reign of heaven that has now come in the person of Jesus. And so, the reason that I'm stressing this is because what that means for us, when we look at the parables, the question that we should not be asking is, what does that parable mean to you? That's not what these parables are. These are not just stories that just teach little moral lessons and we can all just extract some little moral, kind of like a fortune cookie. We'll just take out some moral lesson from these stories. That is not what the parables are about. The question that we should be asking with every parable at least in Matthew 13, is what does this parable teach me about the reign of God that has now come into creation? What does this parable teach me about the kingdom of heaven? What is His reign like? What's the reign of heaven like? What is God like as king? What does the reign of heaven mean for the world? Those are all the things that the parables are about. And so, we are going to consider that question then with the two parables in Matthew 13, 31 to 33. And so we'll start with this question. And even though this isn't in your book, I've laid out this lesson to where I tried to make it easy for those of you that want to take notes. You can write down these things just like you usually do in the book. But here's the question then. What does the parable of the mustard seed teach us about the reign of heaven? Let's look at it. Let's read it. Look at Matthew 13, verses 31 and 32. He put another parable to them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it has grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches." Now, let me just ask you. Let me get your thoughts. What is this parable teaching us about the reign of heaven? The fact that God has brought His kingship, or has exercised His kingship on earth in a new way now that Jesus has come. What does Jesus want us to understand about the reign of heaven from this parable? What are your thoughts? It's like a mustard seed that grows. Yeah, Julia? That the reign of heaven will have humble and perhaps even unnoticeable beginnings. In fact, Julia basically just stole the words from my slide. Let me just put it up here. One thing that this parable teaches us, that Jesus wants us to understand, is that the reign of heaven will begin in a way that is almost undetectable. And that's why I put the picture of the mustard seed up there. Hopefully you can see it. How small that is. I mean, you drop that, it's hard to find, especially if it's on carpet. How tiny it is. And think about it. Jesus is saying, that little mustard seed, that's what I want you to think of when it comes to the reign of heaven. Now, how is that different from what humans would expect? What would you expect the reign of God to be like when it breaks into creation in a new way? What would you expect that to be like? Yeah, Mr. Jim?
To reign in a way that He showed people who got to the king. He would have been, probably had a big military. Kind of like David.
Yeah. Yeah, you would expect, if we're talking about the human Messiah, you would certainly expect that, well, when the Messiah comes to reign on God's behalf, it's going to mean an army. It's going to mean all the physical trappings of kingship that we would expect. Clothing, military victory, all the pomp and circumstance that comes with that. And what about the reign of God? So if that's kind of the human Messiah element, wouldn't we expect, when God comes to reign as king, it's going to be so noticeable. Thunder and lightning and whirlwind, so that everybody is aware, whoa, there's God. There He is, right there. Isn't that what we would expect? Isn't that what we would do if we were God and we had all that power? And yet Jesus is saying to His Jewish audience, who a lot of them would have had those expectations that Mr. Jim just talked about, Jesus is saying, I want you to understand that the reign of heaven is like a mustard seed. That's what the reign of heaven is like. It's almost undetectable. But there's a second part to this parable. So it starts small. But what then is the next lesson that we learn about the reign of heaven from this parable? It starts small. Yeah, Sherman? It starts small, but it is going to expand. Here's how I've worded it. This just adds to what Sherman just said. Its small beginning will produce a large result. That's the other point of this parable. The reign of heaven is like a mustard seed. It's the smallest of all seeds. But a man sowed it in the ground and it became a tree, the largest of all the garden plants, so that the birds came and nested in its branches. The reign of heaven will start in a way that's almost undetectable. But that does not mean that its effect is going to be negligible. It is going to produce something wonderful. Now, this is closely related to the next parable, which we're going to look at. Before we move to the next parable, what questions or thoughts do you have on this parable? What Jesus is teaching about the reign of heaven? What questions or thoughts do you have on this parable? Well, oh, yes, ma'am. It won't. Yeah, go ahead. Yes. Yes, Miss Gloria just said, you can't do away with the kingdom of heaven. It's not going to go anywhere. Which is exactly right. Now, like I said, this parable is closely related to the following parable, to which we now turn. What does the parable of the leaven teach us about the reign of heaven? Look at Matthew 13 and let's read verse 33. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till it was all leavened. What are your thoughts on this one? What is Jesus teaching us about the reign of heaven with this parable? What does he want us to understand? Yeah, Mr. Jim?
Takes a little, and it will spread.
It only takes a little and it will spread. In fact, that little bit that Mr. Jim just referred to, at least in the ESV, what's the word? Because this is an important word. What did the woman do with the leaven? What's the word that's used to describe? It doesn't say she mixed it in. It says, at least in the ESV, it says she hid it. It's hidden. And so what we learn here about the reign of heaven is that it will work in secret. It will work in secret, just like leaven does. In other words, God's reign that was promised in the prophets, the coming of God's reign will not at first change everything dramatically. It will accomplish its purpose, but it's going to do it in a secret way, in a hidden way. Just like leaven is hidden in the flour. However, just as with the previous parable, just because it's working in secret, just because it's just a little bit of leaven, does not mean that its effect will be negligible. Because the other point of this parable is what also Mr. Jim said. It will affect everything. It will affect everything. The same way that that little bit of leaven changed the entire flour until it was all leavened. That's what the reign of heaven is going to be like. Small, secret, hidden, but it will absolutely be successful in changing everything that God has made. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Yes. Yeah, I love what Miss Gloria just said, because she has just tied this to another theme of that. He's talking to his Jewish audience who would have been very familiar with this type of imagery. We, since we're not an agricultural society, some of this imagery may be a little bit lost on us at first. We kind of have to think about it a little more. But what Miss Gloria said is, hey, kind of think about the nature of God's reign, because it starts with the Jewish people. But then remember, by the end of Matthew, it's going to all nations. It will affect everything. All people. All over the world. That's the leaven of the kingdom of heaven. What questions do you have about this parable? Or what questions or thoughts do you have about this parable and what it's teaching us about the promised reign of God that has now broken into creation in the person of Jesus? Yeah, Alan?
Well, I was thinking about 11.
Yes.
But it also signifies that it does have impact. So here we're saying opposite, also showing our impact.
Yes. Yeah, Alan just brought the point that a lot of times in Scripture, leaven is actually a negative metaphor. You know, Paul uses it that way in it's 1 Corinthians, if I remember correctly. A little leaven leavens the whole lump, and he's using it to say allowing a little bit of sin in the church body is going to then corrupt everything. And Jesus is using the same imagery, but with the opposite goal. He's saying, I want you to also think about leaven in terms of the effect of what the reign of heaven is going to be like. It's going to be secret and hidden, but it is going to impact everything, like Alan just said. That's what God's reign is going to be like. Yeah, Mr. Bob, and I'll come back to Sherman up here.
You notice that the smaller
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, Mr. Bob just said, notice he's used the smallest seed, that mustard seed, so tiny. And then when you talk about leaven, you're talking about something that also is very small. In fact, there's, microorganisms are what cause the leavening process to work. Now, I'm not subscribing that Jesus expected his hearers to know all that scientific stuff that we may know. But think of leaven and just how it's just, when you're thinking about the reign of God that Isaiah promised, the reign of God that Zechariah promised, that Hosea promised, it's like leaven. It's like a mustard seed. I mean, is that really what we were expecting here? Is that really what the reign of God is going to be like? That's what Jesus is wanting us to understand. And now, after I get Ms. Gloria's comment, we're going to ask Sherman's comment. I forgot to come back to Sherman. We're going to ask another question and see, okay, what are we going to draw from this? Yes, ma'am. Yes. 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 That's right. Yeah. So when we talk about the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, this whole idea of leaven was something they were very familiar with, which makes then a great imagery for Jesus to use because it's something his audience would have known. Whereas, someone like me, without research, who has no baking experience at all, I would have been like, what is leaven? How does that? Got to look that up. But they would have known exactly what it was. Yeah, Sherman, what were you going to say?
No, I was going to just say, it's funny. The Lord never gives us what we expect to see.
Yeah.
He always gives it in a way that we have to examine it and we have to look at it in a different direction.
Yes.
And once it starts, it's unstoppable.
Yeah.
Everything that is said in the scriptures, it doesn't see anything being halted or being stalled or anything. It just continues to roll.
Yeah.
The conclusion.
That's it. Once His word goes forth, nothing can stop it. It's going to have the effect that God had decreed for it. And Sherman's right. So often in Scripture, God will not give us things the way we expect Him to. Because He's always, or at least so often, He's subverting human wisdom. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more here as we get to these next questions. Here's the next question I want to submit to you. Let's first ask this question. How are the points of these parables illustrated in Jesus' own ministry? So if Jesus is telling us this is what the reign of heaven is like, I want us to now think about how does that play out in Jesus' own ministry? How does His ministry reflect the truths of these two parables that we've just examined? What are your thoughts? How does Jesus' own ministry reflect the truths about the reign of heaven? He is, after all, the Davidic king. He's the one who brings the reign of heaven. But how does His ministry then reflect these truths? Yeah, Mr. Jim?
The kingdom when it first started to the kingdom today. I don't care, Jesus' ministry has spread across the whole world now.
Yes.
And it started with a little handful.
Yeah.
But it just shows it cannot be stopped.
Think about what Mr. Jim said, and this is one I don't have on the screen. So I want to hit two other angles. But Mr. Jim just brought up a great application for how the truths of these parables are illustrated in Jesus' own movement. It started as a man with just a handful of followers. And look at how that leaven has now just gone out into the world. And how now you have people of the kingdom, people who live in loyalty and alignment with God's reign, are now spread out throughout all the world, all nations. That's an illustration of the truth of this parable, the parable of the leaven, or the parable of the mustard seed. Look at how it has grown. Something small, and now it has grown into something large that brings blessing to things. Yeah, Alan?
You don't see where it says rich here.
Yes.
But small.
Yes.
Those are
Yes, I love what Alan just said too, because Alan just brought up another great illustration. When Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount says, blessed are those who are rich, who are powerful. That's not what He says. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek, the ones who get walked on. Mustard seed. Mustard seed theology, maybe you could call it. That's it. Yeah, Julia? Yes. Yes. What Julia's a little closer. I've only got two, because just for time's sake, I could only focus on two. I think what Mr. Jim said is a great answer to this question. I think what Alan said is a great answer to this question. I think what Julia said is a mediocre answer. No, I'm just kidding. I think what Julia said is a great answer to this question. I'm just kidding. What Julia said is a little closer to the angle that I want to focus on here. One of the ways that Jesus' ministry illustrates the truth of this parable is that God's reign comes in the form of a Galilean Nazarene. Don't forget, a few classes ago we talked about this. This is an emphasis of Matthew, that Jesus would be called a Nazarene. And in the Passion story where I showed you those passages where Matthew is emphasizing the fact that Jesus' Galilean heritage stands at odds with those in Jerusalem, the power base of Judaism, where you would expect the Messiah to be operating. Because after all, wasn't the Messiah promised to rebuild the temple? He was. What, didn't God say He would choose Jerusalem and that would be where He would reign? Well then, if Jesus is the Messiah, why is He not operating in Jerusalem? Why is He not operating in the temple? Why is He going in and overturning the tables in the temple and uttering oracles of judgment against the temple? And He's doing it as a Galilean. He's from Nazareth of all places. He's not even from a great place in Galilee. He's from a mustard seed town, a town of no significance, no human pedigree whatsoever. Jesus of Nazareth. And remember, a few weeks ago I used the example in our American culture. I said, if I came to you and I said, here's the Messiah, and you come and you're expecting all these things, and then you see Him and He's shorter than you. He's got this thick country accent that you associate with rednecks, and He's from Bald Knob, Arkansas. And that'll give you some idea of how what we talked about in the class where I showed you, this is how Jews from Judea looked at Galileans. They had an accent. They're backwater Jewish hicks, so to speak. And He's the Messiah? I don't think so. No, that can't be. Yes. And so this is one way that God's reign is illustrated in Jesus' own ministry. God comes to reign in the form of a Galilean Nazarene. And then the second way that these truths are illustrated in Jesus' own ministry is that God's reign comes in the form of a crucified man. A crucified man. So, He's the Messiah, He's the King, but He's on a cross. Rome has won. The Jewish leaders have won. If He was the Messiah, He wouldn't be up there. That's the whole narrative of the Passion story in Matthew's Gospel. The crowds are mocking Him and shaming Him. If you really are the King of Israel, if you really are the Son of God, come down from the cross. To them, kingship would mean He saves Himself. He demonstrates His power in a way that they cannot deny, as if He hadn't already. But what Matthew is telling us is, no, Jesus is that mustard seed. He's the leaven. It's hidden. Who in the world would look at this man on a cross who's gasping for breath and being tortured to death and say, there's God's reign, right there. The victory of Yahweh, right there. Who in the world would have looked at that and said that? Now Matthew tells us Roman centurions did. Truly, this man is a son of God. They see something that the very Jewish audience doesn't see. But who would have guessed that? And so then let me wrap up here with one final question. Or excuse me, two final questions. And for time's sake, let me just go through these here. So we've talked about Julia Allen and Mr. Jim and the 2 points I've made. We've looked at various ways that the truths of the two parables in Matthew 13, 31 to 33, how the truths about the kingdom of heaven are then illustrated in Jesus' own ministry. Well then, here's a question I want us to consider. What do we learn about God from these lessons about the kingdom of heaven. Because after all, if you want to know something about the king, just look at how he reigns. That's going to tell you something about how any ruler, if you want to know something about a ruler, look at how they reign. You'll know something about it. What type of person was Adolf Hitler? Just look at how he reigned. What type of person was Saddam Hussein? Just look how he reigned. Well, what do we learn about God when we examine how's he reigning? Here's one thing I'd submit to you. We learn that God is humble, not ostentatious. God is humble. He has the power to speak into existence the entire cosmos, and yet He's humble. He does not come to creation and exercise His kingship in these gaudy ways, these ostentatious ways. Look at me and look at my power. He comes in the form of this Nazarene who describes himself as meek and lowly. Think about what that says about God and how opposite that is of us. That's one thing we learn about God. But the other thing we learn about God, I'd submit to you, is this. God wants His reign to be seen with the eyes of faith. That's what He wants as king. He wants His reign to be seen with the eyes of faith. In other words, when God brings the reign that He promised in the prophets, He does not beat human beings over the head with it to where they have no choice but to forced to say, okay, yeah, you're king. Now that time is coming. Every knee will kneel before Jesus of Nazareth, will kneel before the kingship of God. But when He brings His kingship into creation, it's at first in a way that's hidden. It's like a mustard seed. Because what God wants as king, He doesn't want to have to beat us into submission. He wants human beings to see what He's doing with the eyes of faith. He wants His kingship to be seen by those who are seeking Him. And so He then brings His reign to earth in a way that only those who are seeking Him and have faith in Him will see it. Everyone else will they'll easily be able to ignore it. Because after all, look at this crucified man, and you're going to worship Him? That's ridiculous. As if that's the reign of your God. Our God is in this temple over here. Look at that glory and the power. Look at the big statue of Zeus. We have the gold, all the precious metals in the temple. That's our God. And after all, we're in charge. Rome. Our gods are obviously more powerful than your God. The Jews with all their idiosyncrasies. And now you've got this sect of Judaism that's worshiping a man who was crucified. That's just wrong. And those views are expressed. There's some extra biblical sources where those very things, I'm paraphrasing, but they're making that point of how this is just a superstition, how weird this is. That's because God wants His reign to be seen by those who have eyes of faith. That's what He wants. And so then that leads us to our final question. How can we align ourselves to the kingdom of heaven? How can we align ourselves to this? Because if we recognize what Jesus is saying about the reign of heaven with these two parables of the mustard seed and the leaven, and we've examined now how that's illustrated in Jesus' ministry, we learn something about God by looking at those truths. Well, then the final question is, how can I align myself to the King? How can I align myself to this reign? Is your hand up, Mr. Yes, sir. Go ahead. Yes. The short answer would be, as Mr. Jim has just said, If you want to align yourself to the kingdom of heaven, then model yourself after the king. Model yourself after the king. Now, how can we do that? Here's two ways. Two ways that just flesh out what Mr. Jim has just said. One way is we have to give up our human notions of power and prestige. Give up our human notions of power and prestige. In Matthew 18, verse 1, the disciples come to Jesus and they ask him, who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Because they're still operating within this framework of human notions of power and prestige. And so, who's the greatest? And Jesus brings a child to them, someone with no status in that ancient Near Eastern society, and says, unless you become like this little mustard seed person, no status. Unless you become like that, you cannot even enter the kingdom of heaven. You can't be aligned with God's reign unless you become like this. As humans, our proclivity is to tout ourselves and try to bring ourselves glory. You think of sports, in the Olympics now, what we have going on. It's common. When somebody does something great in sports, it's common to bring glory to myself, pump the chest, take off the shirt, show those abs to everybody. Take them off. Look at me. Look at what I just did. That's human nature. All of us are subject to that. Or maybe in the church, I want to have this position because I want the power. I want the prestige that comes with this position. Oh, you need someone to take out the trash? Oh, no, that's not for me. Let someone else do that. That's for other Christians, not me. I was meant to be an elder. All of that is antithetical to how God reigns. And when we become like that, we no longer resemble the king. We resemble the ultimate rebel to the king, the adversary, Satan, who is anti-Christ. So one way we need to align ourselves to the kingdom of heaven is we have to give up all our notions of power and prestige that we so often succumb to. And then one more. We can align ourselves to the kingdom of heaven by responding to the world's hatred with love and humility. Respond to the world's hatred with love and humility. When Jesus was opposed, when he was nailed to that cross, his response of love and humility looked like weakness. It looked like defeat. And yet, it was through that weakness that God defeated all the evil powers, that God brought redemption to His creation. And if we are going to model ourselves after the King, if we're going to align ourselves with the reign of heaven, we are going to meet opposition just like our King did. We're going to be hated by the world. Jesus makes that very clear in Matthew's Gospel. How will we respond to that? Rex brought it up in his sermon this morning. Our human nature is to say, you don't talk to me that way. You disrespect me, I'm going to disrespect you. You slap me across my cheek, I'm going to slap you across yours. That's our human nature. Retaliation. But if we want to align ourselves to the reign of heaven, we have to bear that mistreatment with love and humility, and we need to be willing to bear those insults. It's going to look like we're weak. It's going to look like we're defeated. But through our apparent weakness, we will be sharing in the victory of King Jesus. Whether that's in bringing others to Christ because they see how we're responding to that mistreatment, or if not that, in the last day, when Jesus returns and vindicates all his people who were insulted by the world, and the entire world will recognize those people that we were mocking and insulting were the ones who were the king's people the whole time. We will be vindicated if we respond with love and humility as our king has. That's how we can align ourselves to the kingdom of heaven. God has exercised his kingship in creation just as he promised he would in the Old Testament. But his reign doesn't look like what we would expect. That's because he operates according to the values of heaven, not the values of the earth. And so what he calls us to do is to respond to his kingship by aligning ourselves with his reign, by modeling ourselves after King Jesus, the man from Nazareth of Galilee. With that, we'll end today's lesson. So next week, we'll look at some other lessons about the kingdom of heaven from Matthew's gospel. Thanks for your great thoughts today. God be with you this week.